Hello, everybody. My name's Ian Werkheiser, and I'm presenting a paper I co-authored with my colleague Kevin Elliott entitled A Framework for Transparency in Precision Livestock Farming. Now, Kevin and I, being philosophers and ethicists, think it's important to talk about ethical issues in PLF. And if you look at the small but growing body of literature in that area, a few themes are already kind of emerging. So just a few examples. Large farms are often better positioned to be early adopters of a technology, which can lead to the consolidation of fewer and fewer larger and larger farms. Depending on your ethical commitments, that might worry you for its effect on rural communities or jobs or food systems in a society. At the same time, PLF promises the ability to intensify agriculture as more animals are under care in a given operation. That might worry you on environmental ethical grounds or animal ethical grounds. Certainly if you think that there shouldn't be any animal products in a food system, then intensification of livestock production is taking us in the wrong direction. Another example is ethical concerns around privacy. So who has access to data generated by PLF, under what circumstances, and how is that information preserved and stored and transmitted? And then also research about PLF, how you balance IP and copyright concerns with the importance of collaborating on an emerging technology. As another example, the relationship between farmers and livestock, when it's being mediated through these new technologies, might change in ways that can affect animal welfare outcomes, and also in ways that might affect farmers, right? Changing the skills that they need, their day-to-day lived experience, what it's like to be a farmer. So those and other themes besides are already being discussed, but what we haven't seen a lot of discussion of in the literature is transparency, even though transparency is important for achieving a lot of these ethical ends, and it's important in its own right on ethics and justice grounds. So what we're trying to do in this paper is to provide a framework for pursuing transparency about PLF. And that's not as easy as it sounds. Different stakeholders and communities care about different kinds of information, and different sorts of challenges arise when we provide that to them. So our framework has 4 parts, and so does this talk. So the first part is thinking about the audience. So who are you talking to when you provide transparency? Who's that transparency for, and what are their needs and concerns? And then that will naturally lead into what sort of content ought to be provided to them. When you know who the audience is and what the content is, certain sorts of challenges arise that are unique to that situation. And then we're going to round out the conversation by thinking about what kinds of strategies suggest themselves to address those challenges. So as we think about the audience, we're building on cautionary tales from the open science movement, which is a push for transparency in science. And it's emphasized that it's not enough just to make peer-reviewed articles more available, free, or to provide the data underlying those articles, that the data you provide has to be meaningful to specific audiences. And different audiences have those different needs. So here are just a few examples of some audiences for PLF and what their concerns might be or what their needs might be. But of course, to actually work through this framework, you would need to do empirical research with these audiences. You'd need to figure out who is actually in these audiences, making sure no one's being disincluded, making sure that you're thinking about them in the right groupings, and then actually doing the empirical work and finding out what their concerns are and what their needs are. But just as possible examples, other scientists and engineers actually do want that data that I was saying not everybody wants. They do want to know what the methodology used was, what data was generated, confidence intervals, things like that. Farmers might not want all of that. Instead, what they might want are take-home lessons about what the system actually does or what it promises to do, how it works, what changes they would need to make on their farm to incorporate it, and what the benefits of that would be, and also honest conversations about what the limitations of that would be. What doesn't it do, and what the costs might be to them. On the other hand, consumers might be concerned about the thing that they're buying, what values it's supporting or are embedded in it, and if it matches their values. Think about commitment people have to free-range chickens or organic produce. Regulators might be concerned about regulating PLF technologies, whether or not new regulations need to be in place, and also how PLF technologies might support or hinder compliance with current regulations. And then industry, of course, has a number of interests based on which groups are interacting with. So, for example, distributors might be concerned about being able to provide information to the consumers, but also being able to provide information to the farmers that are going through them. So once you thought through these different audiences and their needs, that sort of naturally leads into different kinds of content that we might need to make available in different circumstances. So again, just a few examples. It might be necessary to provide the basic workings of a PLF system, including its strengths and honest conversations about its limitations, not just trying to sell it to people. The data generated by PLF systems, certain people are going to want that in certain circumstances. The operations of machine learning algorithms, particularly in closed loop systems and particularly in deep learning algorithms in closed loop systems, how those work, what they're, how reliable are they? The values of the developers who built this system. So, were they trying to pursue financial viability only or environmental sustainability as well? What about animal welfare, things like that? What were their design goals? And then also the implicit values embedded in the PLF system. So what kind of assumptions are being made? What kind of values are built into that, right? About the agency of the users, what sorts of farms are you imagining? What kinds of consumers are you imagining? Those sorts of things when you're doing the design work. Now, hopefully, as soon as I started talking about these different audiences and these different kinds of content, challenges to providing that information arose in your own mind as you're listening to this, right? So just a few examples of the kinds of challenges we're talking about here. There might be a lack of understanding of audiences of the relevant content. So even though a particular audience might need or want some kind of information, it might be difficult for them to understand that information unless presented in the right way. There might also be lack of knowledge or awareness of developers of their own implicit values and assumptions, right? It's a well-discussed topic in philosophy of technology is that a lot of values can be built into a technology that weren't intended or even well understood by the designers themselves. There might also be lack of trust, both lack of trust by audiences in the people providing the information about PLF, how it works, and then also perhaps a lack of trust in the data of the PLF technology. And that might be issues of trustability. So people don't seem like you should trust them, in their rhetoric and their communication, but also might be issues of trustworthiness. People might be quite justified in not trusting people, which is, like a damaged relationship, which makes it difficult to communicate. There might be also incentives to limit information sharing, right, on both sides. So, farmers might not want to provide, for example, all of the information gathered about their animals to regulators and consumers and industry, perhaps for selfish ends, or perhaps because they think that information will be taken out of context or misunderstood in ways that will harm them. And then also, I was talking about machine learning algorithms. There can be inherent difficulties in understanding them beyond sort of a superficial level of we put in these inputs and we get these outputs. How it actually works, if you're not a computer scientist and you're interested in, like the number of nodes and the training and data sets that were used, the iterations, things like that. If you want to know, like, actually what features from the environment is this deep learning algorithm picking out, why those features, that can be really difficult to communicate or even to understand, including for the designers who made the system. So given those challenges, a few strategies suggest themselves. One very common one is collaboration with stakeholders early and often. So not just developing a technology and then doing market research about how to sell it, but embedding the concerns and the desires and the lived sort of realities of stakeholders very early in the process, in the design process, and throughout the design process. This increases trust. Both trustability and trustworthiness. It increases buy-in, and it's more likely that the technology will reflect the actual needs of the audience that it's being developed for. And for transparency, they'll understand it already, right? So as the technology is being rolled out, they've already had a long time to process it and understand it. Less challenging than stakeholder collaborations is just making the system require less transparency by making it a little bit simpler. This has trade-offs, but for example, if there's an option for closed loop system to be an open loop system, so that instead of regulating, the amount of food and the timing of food that's provided to individual animals based on their needs automatically, instead that information and a suggestion is provided to livestock operators who can then make their own decisions. That, it's less efficient, but it can decrease the need for transparency, because they don't need to know how an algorithm is working if it's just making suggestions versus if it's automatically feeding their animals. Another important thing might be to acknowledge major guiding values. So to talk about, if animal welfare was a concern, what do you mean by animal welfare? Were you thinking about an animal's ability to engage in species typical behavior, or only thinking about it in terms of reducing disease and pain and suffering for the animals? If that was a concern and economic viability was a concern, how were these tensions resolved during the design process? Was one of them more important than the other? Were you willing to sacrifice economic efficiency for animal welfare, or was animal welfare something that was pursued, but it had to be economically viable so farmers would use it? How was that thought through? And sometimes this would require various processes and mechanisms, which are discussed in the paper, to help designers surface and think about the assumptions and implicit values that they built into the technology, perhaps unintentionally. When trust is harmed, independent verifications of claims can be quite helpful. As people think about, a trusted third party, think about like organic certification. If you don't trust particular people to report on their own, and it also preserves privacy because they don't need to make that information widely available. They can give it to a trusted third party. And in terms of explaining complicated algorithms, there's a lot of work being done already in explainable AI, including sensitivity analyses, to think carefully about errors and lacunae in data sets and reliability and things like that. But basically, what we're trying to argue is that transparency deserves more discussion as a major ethical issue than PLF, both in its own right and in order to pursue other good ethical goals. And we're suggesting a framework for thinking about transparency in this context, being sensitive to who you're talking to and making things transparent for, letting that lead the content that you're providing, and thinking carefully about the challenges for that unique situation and strategies you might pursue to overcome it. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we're going to go to Q&A now, but also feel free to email Kevin or myself. We'd be happy to talk about this.